You still pretend to be his wife." Victoria Langley said it in front of 200 guests. Then her hand rose deliberate, meant to be seen by every single person in that garden. Anne didn't move. She looked at her husband. Frederick Pembroke was 4 steps away. He saw it. He did nothing. Then another man moved. Alexander Whitmore stepped forward, closed his hand around Victoria's wrist, quiet as a door closing, and said one word. "Enough." The garden went absolutely silent. And Frederick realized in that moment what his silence had just cost him. If you've ever waited for someone to defend you, and they looked away, you already know this pain. Subscribe to our channel and tell us what city are you watching from today. The garden party at Pembroke Hall had been Frederick's idea. He'd announced it 3 weeks prior over breakfast, folding his newspaper with the particular satisfaction of a man who believed he still had something worth celebrating. 200 invitations. White tents stretched across the south lawn. A string quartet arranged near the fountain. He'd gone over the guest list with Anne twice, pointing out names she already knew, explaining social connections she'd managed for years without his assistance. "It will be good for us," he'd said, reaching for more toast. "Show people we're well." Anne had smiled, the way she always smiled when Frederick said things that no longer touched her. She'd spent the better part of a week managing the arrangements, coordinating with the kitchen, approving the floral order, writing personal notes to accompany the invitations. She knew the names of the head footman's children. She knew which guests required dietary consideration and which required careful seating arrangements to avoid old quarrels erupting over the salmon course. She did all of it quietly, the way she did everything, because that was what was expected of a wife in her position. What was not expected, what had never once been anticipated, was for her to stand in the middle of her own garden and realize that she had organized a party for a husband who'd long since stopped belonging to her. The morning of the party. Frederick had dressed with particular care. Anne noticed. She noticed everything about him now, with the detached clinical attention of someone cataloging damage. His new cravat. The way he checked his reflection twice. The particular cologne something lighter than what he usually wore. She said nothing. She buttoned her pale blue gloves and descended the stairs ahead of him, and she received the first guests with exactly the warmth and composure the occasion demanded. Victoria Langley arrived at 2:30. She came without announcement because women like Victoria never needed one. She moved through the garden with the unhurried certainty of someone who believed she owned whatever room she entered, or in this case, whatever lawn. She was beautiful in the way that certain weapons are beautiful, all clean lines and dangerous capability. She wore deep green, and her dark hair was arranged with the studied perfection of someone who'd spent considerable time achieving the appearance of effortlessness. Anne knew who she was. Of course she did. Anne had known for longer than she'd ever let Frederick suspect. She watched Victoria cross the lawn with the careful attention of a woman who had learned to read every social situation before it fully announced itself. She watched Victoria laugh at something the Earl of Ashton said. She watched Victoria accept a glass of champagne. And she watched with the particular stillness of someone bracing for impact as Frederick spotted Victoria from across the garden, and something shifted in his expression. Something alive. Something that no longer came to his face when he looked at his wife. Anne turned back to Lady Harrington and continued discussing the merits of the new music instructor at the Harrington estate. She did not allow her voice to waver. She did not allow her hands to move. She was very good at this. She'd had years of practice. The afternoon wore on. The string quartet moved from Haydn to a gentle Mozart. Servants circulated with silver trays. Anne made 3 full circuits of the party, speaking to every significant guest, ensuring every conversation felt attended to, every social obligation honored. She was the perfect hostess. She was everything a Pembroke wife was meant to be. And somewhere behind her, Frederick had stopped moving away from Victoria Langley. It was Lady Castleton who first came to stand near Anne, not to say anything directly, but with the particular proximity of a woman who wanted to offer solidarity without having to name the reason for it. Then Mrs. Farthington joined them. Then young Miss Selby, who was barely 20 and still new enough to society to sometimes say the quiet parts aloud. Mrs. Pembroke. Miss Selby began with the bright obliviousness of youth. Your husband seems quite taken with Miss Selby. Lady Castleton's voice was gentle but firm. Have you tried the strawberry tart? Cook has done something remarkable with the cream. Miss Selby blinked. Then she understood and fell into a thorough examination of the dessert table. Anne thanked Lady Castleton with a look. You are doing beautifully, Lady Castleton said quietly, linking her arm through Anne's. Keep walking. They walked. And Anne kept her spine straight and her expression composed, because the alternative was unthinkable. It was when she stepped away to the far end of the rose walk. Just for a moment, just to collect herself, just to breathe air that didn't feel weighted with the awareness of everyone watching her husband be in love with someone else, that Victoria found her. She didn't stumble upon her. That was important to understand later, when Anne turned the moment over and over in her mind, looking for where she could have moved differently, responded faster, been better prepared. Victoria had not accidentally wandered to the far end of the rose walk. She had followed her there. The garden grew quieter at this end. The music was softer. Guests nearby had drifted toward the dessert tables. There were perhaps 30 people within earshot, but they might as well have been 200, because every single one of them was paying attention to the two women standing among the roses. Victoria's expression was composed, even pleasant. She had the particular mastery of the society woman who could deliver a wound and make it look like a compliment. Lady Pembroke. She inclined her head. What a lovely party. Miss Langley. Anne's voice was even. I'm glad you're enjoying yourself. Victoria tilted her head slightly. Her eyes moved over Anne with the deliberate unhurry of an appraisal. Not the way women look at a dress or a piece of jewelry. The way someone looks at an obstacle they're deciding how to remove. You know? Victoria said, lifting her champagne glass and letting her gaze drift across the garden before returning. I used to wonder about women in your situation. I'd think, how do they do it? How do they stand at their own parties and smile and pour the tea and act as though nothing is happening? She paused. A small cold smile touched her mouth. But I understand now. There isn't anything else to do, is there, when a man has already made his choice? Anne said nothing. She did not trust herself to speak yet. You still pretend to be his wife. The words arrived not loudly. That was what made them so precise. Victoria had not raised her voice. She had not performed the question for the crowd. She had simply said it with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone stating a truth that everyone present already knew. And it was that quietness, that absolute confidence, that made it land with the force of a declaration. The conversations around them extinguished one by one. Anne felt the weight of 200 eyes settle onto her shoulders. She felt Frederick's presence somewhere to her left, close enough to have heard, close enough to have stepped forward. She looked at him. She did not mean to. It was instinct, the same way you look toward a door when you need to know if it will open. I was standing with Lord Everton. He had heard. She could see in the set of his jaw that he had heard every word. And she watched his face cycle through something: awareness, discomfort, calculation, and then settle into stillness. He did not move. He said nothing. He chose nothing. And in that choosing of nothing, he made a choice that was as deliberate and as final as anything he had ever said aloud. Victoria's hand was beginning to rise. Not fast. With the studied slowness of someone who wanted every person present to see what they were doing, to understand that they were doing it, to carry the image home with them in the evening. It was a gesture designed for spectacle. A slap was painful, but the anticipation of one delivered in public in the rose walk of her own home at a party she had organized was a different kind of destruction. And then a hand closed around Victoria's wrist, not roughly. That was the thing Anne would remember: how unhurried it was. How perfectly, dangerously calm. Alexander Whitmore stepped forward. He wasn't a large man particularly. He was built with the angular economy of someone who'd learned early that presence came from bearing, not size. He was perhaps 35, with the kind of face that had been improved rather than diminished by weather and time. Fine at the jaw, steady at the brow, with gray eyes that looked at you with the direct assessing quality of a man who did not waste attention on things that didn't matter. He held Victoria's wrist loosely, not painfully, with exactly enough pressure to stop her and make the stop irreversible. Enough. A single word, quiet as a door closing. The garden was absolutely silent. Victoria turned to look at him with the startled fury of someone who had never once been interrupted in the middle of doing exactly as they pleased. Her eyes went to his hand on her wrist, then to his face. She was calculating. Anne could see her calculating. Mr. Whitmore. No. Still quiet, still entirely terribly calm. We're done here, Miss Langley. She stared. The garden stared at both of them. Victoria's composure held. She was good, Anne would give her that, but there was something fractured at the edges of it. She had not anticipated this particular development. Alexander released her wrist. He stepped back half a pace and turned to Anne. He removed his hat with one hand, a small gesture, but a real one. The kind of mark of respect you extended to someone you genuinely meant to honor. Lady Pembroke. His voice was steady. Are you all right? Anne opened her mouth. Nothing came out. She was not all right. She was the furthest thing from all right that she could imagine. She was standing in her own rose walk, with 200 people watching her discover the precise dimensions of her humiliation. She was standing in the place where her husband should have stepped and had not. But she raised her chin. Because she was a Pembroke wife, and she had learned that chin-raising was sometimes the only remaining act of sovereignty. I am fine, she said. Thank you, Mr. Whitmore. He nodded once. He didn't move away immediately. He stayed close enough to be a presence, far enough to not be presumptuous in the particular way of someone who understood that a woman who'd just been publicly abandoned needed someone to stand nearby for a moment. Not to rescue her, just to stand. Victoria, with the remaining shreds of her dignity collected and packed, turned and walked back towards the main party. No one made way for her. That was new. People stepped aside, but they didn't soften as they did. Several guests turned their backs quite deliberately and resumed conversations. Lady Castleton appeared at Anne's elbow like a general arriving on a battlefield. Come with me, darling. Let's get some air. We're outside, Anne said. Better air. Lady Castleton took her arm and steered her firmly toward a quieter part of the grounds. Anne went. She held herself together with both hands, figuratively speaking, because the alternative was to sit down in the rose walk and not get up for a considerable time, and she refused. She refused absolutely. Frederick watched her go. She felt him watching. She did not look at him. The rest of the party was endured. That was the honest word, endured. Anne returned, and she stood where she was supposed to stand, and she said the right things to the right people, and she did not cry, and she did not make a scene, and she did not by any visible indication suggest that her marriage was not exactly the solid, dignified arrangement it was supposed to appear. But something had shifted. Inside the careful architecture of her composure, something had moved. The guests departed in stages by 4s and 6s, with backward glances that she noted and catalogued and set aside for later consideration. The servants began clearing. The string quartet packed their instruments. The white tents came down with the particular melancholy of celebrations definitively concluded. Frederick found her in the drawing room. He closed the door behind him. He stood with his hands behind his back, which was what he did when he was preparing a position rather than an apology. Anne recognized it. She'd been married to him for 11 years. She recognized every posture he had. Anne. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and waited. What happened today? My husband stood 4 steps away, Anne said, while a woman raised her hand to strike me. It wasn't. He stopped. Started again. You misread the situation. Victoria was. Victoria was doing exactly what she intended to do. The situation needed no reading. It announced itself clearly. You could have walked away. The words came out with a defensive certainty that told her he'd rehearsed them at least partially. You didn't need to stand there and engage her. If I'd simply what Frederick. Anne kept her voice measured. Not cold. Measured. If I had simply turned and walked away from my own rose walk at my own party in my own home, how many of those 200 guests would have counted it as dignity, and how many as defeat? He didn't answer. I stood where I stood, she continued. because walking away would have given her everything. I stayed because I still believed even then in that moment that my husband might decide I was worth defending. The room was quiet. And then he did, she said. Just not the husband I was hoping for. Frederick's jaw tightened. Whitmore had no business inserting himself into. Someone had to. It wasn't sharp. That was the terrible thing. It was just a fact stated plainly, and it landed harder than any accusation. Someone had to Frederick, and it wasn't going to be me, and it wasn't going to be you, so it was a stranger. He is not a... He stopped himself. Not a stranger. Anne looked at him. Then what is he? Because until this afternoon, I couldn't have told you much more about Alexander Whitmore than his name and his estate. He was an acquaintance. He was a guest. And yet he stepped forward when my husband did not. She paused. I keep coming back to that. I keep trying to understand it. You're making too much of this. The words hit her differently than they might have once. They didn't wound so much as confirm. They settled into a space inside her that had been making room for them for years. This particular combination of dismissal and minimization, and they told her something clearly that she had been refusing to hear in the same clear way. I don't think I am, she said. Frederick crossed to the window. His back to her, another posture she knew. The putting of distance. The physical expression of his desire to be somewhere else, having this conversation with a different version of her, the version that accepted what she was told and adjusted accordingly. This will blow over, he said to the glass. People will find something else to talk about by Thursday. Perhaps they will. Anne unclasped her hands and smoothed her skirt. I don't particularly care what people find to talk about on Thursday. He turned. Something in her tone had registered the particular flatness of it, the absence of the usual careful accommodation. What does that mean? It means I'm tired. She stood. I'm going to bed, Frederick. We can continue this tomorrow if you'd like, though I suspect you'll find by morning that you'd rather not. She walked past him. At the door she paused. Thank you for the garden party, she said. It was in its way very clarifying. She left him standing in the drawing room, and she climbed the stairs alone, and she sat at her vanity and looked at her own face for a long time. The woman looking back at her was composed. Her hair was still perfectly arranged. Her expression was controlled. She looked to anyone who might have been watching like a woman who had simply had a long day. But behind her eyes, something was changing. Something that had been very still for a very long time was beginning to move. She thought of Victoria's voice. You still pretend to be his wife. She thought of Frederick's stillness. 4 steps away. The choosing of silence. And she thought of Alexander Whitmore's hand, unhurried, certain, arriving exactly when it should have, closing around a wrist and stopping what no one else had moved to stop. Enough. She turned that word over in her mind. The way he'd said it. Not angry, not performative, just certain. The way someone speaks when they have decided something and mean it absolutely. She had spent 11 years married to a man who never once spoke with that kind of certainty about her. She reached up and began to take the pins from her hair one by one, placing them on the vanity. Outside, she could hear the last of the servants moving through the garden gathering chairs. The party was over. Something else she suspected was just beginning. 3 days passed. Anne did not seek conversation with Frederick, and he did not seek it with her, which told her a great deal about how well he was sleeping with his conscience. Married people who feel genuinely guilty cannot leave things unaddressed. Married people who feel briefly uncomfortable can wait with remarkable patience. Frederick, it appeared, was waiting. She managed the household. She answered her correspondence. She accepted an invitation to Lady Castleton's Thursday gathering with the particular gratitude of a woman who needed the company of friends who were too well-bred to say the obvious things, but kind enough to mean them anyway. It was Lady Castleton who mentioned Alexander Whitmore first, and she did it with the particular casualness of a woman who has chosen her moment carefully. He's Lord Whitmore's second son, she said, pouring tea. Has a modest estate in Devonshire, manages it himself, rather than leaving it to agents. Interesting man. Not fashionable in the way that tends to go wrong, but principled, or so I'm told. You're telling me about him very specifically, Anne observed. Lady Castleton's expression was serene. I'm simply sharing information. What you do with it is your own business. The following morning brought a note to Pembroke Hall, written in a clean, unhurried hand, directed to Lady Pembroke. No other markings. Lady Pembroke. I have thought often about the events of Saturday, and hope you will forgive the forward nature of this note. It seemed wrong to simply continue as though nothing had passed. I hope you are well. I hope you are less troubled than circumstances might suggest. If there is anything in my power to be of service, you have only to say, yours respectfully, A. Whitmore. She read it twice. Then she folded it and placed it in her writing desk beneath the correspondence. She answered promptly, and above the correspondence she was not yet ready to address. She sat for a while and looked at the desk. Then she took out a fresh piece of stationery and wrote Mr. Whitmore, Your note was received with more gratitude than I can adequately express. There is nothing to forgive. Forward seems to me a strange word for what was in fact simply decent. I am well, or rather I am better than I was. I find I am uncertain whether those are the same thing. Lady Pembroke. She sealed it and gave it to the footman without examining too closely whether she was being wise. He replied the same afternoon. Lady Pembroke. In my experience, better than I was, and well, are very rarely the same thing. But the first is how it always begins. That seems worth knowing. A. Whitmore. She read this one standing by the window, and something very small happened at the corner of her mouth. Something she hadn't anticipated. Frederick appeared in the doorway. He glanced at the note in her hand. His eyes moved to her face, the specific sharp attention of a man who has just noticed something he hadn't been expecting. Correspondence, he said. Yes. She folded it. From Lady Castleton regarding Thursday. Frederick watched her a moment longer. Then he nodded and moved away. And Anne, alone by the window with Alexander Whitmore's note in her hand, stood very still and considered exactly what it meant that she had just lied to her husband. Not for Frederick's sake, for her own. That distinction she was beginning to understand was everything. The following Saturday, Alexander Whitmore called on Lady Castleton, as he apparently did, with some regularity, and Lady Castleton happened to have invited Anne, and the meeting was therefore entirely coincidental and completely arranged. Anne arrived first. She had dressed with the particular care of someone who has told herself she is not dressing with particular care. She wore deep blue, not the pale accommodating blue she'd worn to the garden party, but a darker shade, something with weight to it. Lady Castleton greeted her with the innocent expression of a woman who has spent 60 years learning to look innocent. When Alexander arrived, he paused at the sight of her. Not awkwardly. With a kind of settled recognition, the look of someone who is unsurprised to find themselves glad. Lady Pembroke. He bowed. Mr. Whitmore. She offered her hand. I was just thanking Lady Castleton for another of her entirely accidental arrangements. Lady Castleton beamed. They sat near the window, not close enough to be remarked upon, close enough to talk without managing their voices. How are you? He asked. Not the social question, the actual one. She considered it. Confused, she said with a directness she hadn't planned. I find that's the honest answer, and I've recently decided I'm tired of the dishonest ones. What are you confused about? About what kind of woman I'm meant to be next? She looked at her hands. I've been Frederick's wife for 11 years. I've been very good at it. And I've been thinking lately about the enormous amount of energy I've spent being good at something that perhaps was never as mutual as I imagined. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you were never difficult to love, Lady Pembroke. His voice was level. No performance in it. You were simply loved by someone who stopped looking. The words arrived with the quality of something true. She looked at him for a long moment. That's either very kind or very presumptuous, Mr. Whitmore. Both probably. A slight understated expression that on another man might have been a grin. I am occasionally guilty of both. How do you know you're correct? Because, he said, I watched you manage that garden party for 4 hours before any of this happened. I watched you speak to people with genuine interest. I watched you make strangers comfortable and mediate a tension between Lord Harrington and his neighbor that I doubt either of them realized you'd noticed. You are not someone who is difficult to see. The failure was not yours." Anne looked away, out the window. Something in her chest was doing something complicated, and she needed a moment before she could trust her voice. "My husband would tell you I misread the situation." Not quite agreement. Not quite dismissal. "With respect, your husband is trying to live with a decision he made in your rose walk, and that kind of man typically requires someone to have misread something in order to sleep at night." She breathed, once, steadily. "You don't know him well." "No. But I know what I saw. A man 4 steps away from the moment his wife needed him, and a man who then chose to discuss it with the quality of someone who's been rehearsing." She turned back. "You heard that. Lord Everton talks at considerable volume when he's had champagne, and I was standing nearby." He met her eyes without apology. "I'm sorry. You deserved better than that conversation." "I deserved better than a great many things," Anne said, and was surprised by how steady her own voice was, how simply stated, as though she had finally, in this particular sentence, landed on something accurate. He nodded. No argument, no correction, no attempt to soften or manage, just yes. "You did." She had not realized until that moment how much she had needed someone to agree with her without a caveat. Lady Castleton materialized with a fresh pot of tea and the cheerful obliviousness of a woman who had engineered the entire scene and was extremely satisfied with its progress. "More tea, Mr. Whitmore." "Please," he said, and he did not move his attention from Anne, and the warmth in his eyes when he looked at her was not the warmth of a man pursuing an opportunity. It was the warmth of a man who had decided someone was worth his attention and meant to give it honestly. Anne accepted her cup and allowed herself for the first time in longer than she could accurately calculate to simply sit with someone who made her feel not rescued, not managed, not accommodated, seen. It was a modest miracle, she thought. And it was the most extraordinary thing that had happened to her in years. Outside, the London street moved on. Carriages, foot traffic, the ordinary machinery of a world that had no idea something was changing in the small drawing room of Lady Castleton's townhouse. Anne finished her tea. She set the cup down. She looked at Alexander Whitmore across the small table and thought of Frederick's silence in the rose walk and of this man's voice. Enough. And she thought perhaps that was the right word for where she was standing. Perhaps she had been silenced for long enough. Perhaps something now was beginning. The note from Lady Castleton arrived on a Tuesday, and Anne read it 3 times before she set it down. Not because the words were complicated, because she was stalling, because reading it a 4th time would require her to decide something, and she had spent 11 years deciding things in the direction of Frederick Pembroke, and the machinery of that habit was slow to reverse. She set the note down. She picked up her teacup. She looked out the window at the street below, where an ordinary London morning was conducting itself without any awareness that the woman watching it was quietly coming apart at her foundations. The note was an invitation to a small Thursday gathering. Informal, intimate. Lady Castleton's way of saying, "Come and be among people who will not require anything of you except your company." Anne had always loved her for that particular skill, the ability to offer relief without naming what she was relieving. She wrote back and accepted. Then she folded her hands on the desk and sat with the stillness of someone who has finished one task and cannot yet bring herself to begin the next. Frederick had not apologized. She had waited in the way that women wait when they have decided they will not ask, when they believe still that the person they married must eventually arrive at the obvious thing on his own. She had waited through Sunday dinner, through Monday's silent breakfast, through a Tuesday morning in which Frederick had discussed estate business with his solicitor in the study for 2 hours, and then departed for his club without once appearing in the same room as his wife. She had stopped waiting somewhere around Tuesday noon. It wasn't dramatic. That was the thing about the end of hope. It rarely announced itself. It simply stopped arriving. You reached for it and found your hand closing on empty air, and you understood with a quiet that was somehow worse than noise that you had been doing that for longer than you'd admitted. Frederick came home that evening in good spirits. He'd had a productive afternoon, apparently. He mentioned something about a new investment. He asked whether dinner was at 7. He looked at Anne with the pleasant, slightly distracted attention of a man who considers his domestic life well in order, and she thought he genuinely believes everything is fine. That was when she understood the true dimension of what she was dealing with. Not cruelty. Something more complicated than cruelty, and in some ways harder to address. Frederick was not malicious. He was simply absent. Present in body, located in the same rooms, eating at the same table, and wholly catastrophically absent from any genuine awareness of what was happening inside the woman he'd married. He poured himself a glass of port. He mentioned that Lord Everton had asked after her. "How kind," Anne said. "Said you handled yourself with remarkable composure on Saturday." His words. Frederick settled into his chair with the ease of a man at rest. "I thought the whole thing had been blown rather out of proportion, frankly. But it's good that people noticed your steadiness." Anne looked at him for a long moment. "My steadiness? Some women would have made a scene." He sipped his port. "You didn't. That reflects well." "On whom?" He glanced up. Something in her tone had registered just the edge of it. "On both of us, naturally." "I see." She set her book aside. "And Victoria Langley. What does her behavior reflect?" Victoria was. He stopped. Reset. "That situation was more complicated than it appeared. Tell me how." He looked at her, the way he always looked at her, when she pressed past the point he'd allotted for a conversation with the slight tightening of a man who had expected an off-ramp and found the road continuing. "Anne, I'm asking sincerely, Frederick, help me understand. Because from where I was standing it appeared quite simple. A woman threatened me in my own garden. You were present. You chose not to intervene." She kept her voice level. She was proud of that. "How does it become complicated? You're twisting what happened." "I am describing what happened. You were not in any real danger." She raised her hand to strike me. 3 words spaced. "In front of 200 guests. In our rose walk. At our party." She held his gaze. "If that had happened to someone you were genuinely invested in protecting, would you still call it not a real danger?" The silence that followed was its own kind of answer. Frederick put his port down. Stood. Moved to the window, which was his habitual retreat, when a conversation was demanding more than he'd budgeted for it. "I think you're upset. I'm past upset. Still level, still controlled. I've moved through upset and arrived somewhere quieter, and I need you to understand that quieter is not the same as finished." He turned. Something on his face that might have been the beginning of genuine engagement. She waited. "What do you want me to say, Anne?" "I want you to say what's true." Another silence. Longer this time. "I didn't handle it well," he said finally. "That's the honest answer. I saw it happening, and I hesitated. And by the time I'd decided to—" He stopped. "Whitmore moved first." "Why did you hesitate?" He didn't answer. "Frederick." She waited. "Why did you hesitate?" "Because." He looked at the window, at the dark glass, at his own reflection and whatever he found there. "Because confronting Victoria in that moment would have required me to make a very public statement about what she is to me, and what you are, and I wasn't." He stopped again. "You weren't ready," Anne said, very quietly. He didn't confirm it. He didn't need to. The room seemed to rearrange itself around those 3 words. Anne sat with them, turned them over, set them down carefully, the way you set down something fragile when you realize it might be heavier than it looks. Her husband had stood in their rose walk and watched a woman threaten her, and he had hesitated, and the reason for his hesitation was that defending his wife would have required him to draw a line he wasn't yet willing to draw. She had known this. Some part of her had known. But knowing and hearing those were different countries, and she had just crossed the border. "I appreciate your honesty," she said. He turned faintly surprised as though he'd braced for something louder. "I mean that," she continued. "It's the most honest thing you've said to me in a considerable time. I'd rather have that than another evening of port and pleasantries." "Anne, I'm going to bed." She stood. Think about what you said tonight. About readiness. About what it means that you weren't. She smoothed her skirt. I'll be thinking about it too. She climbed the stairs alone for the second time in a week, and she sat at her vanity for a long time, and she did not cry. She had moved past crying as well, apparently. She was in some farther country she hadn't been to before, where things were clear and cold and honest, and she was learning slowly to breathe the air there. She thought of one specific word. Ready. Her husband had not been ready to defend her, had not been ready to declare his allegiance in a moment that required one, had stood at the crossroads between his wife and the woman he'd been spending his attention on, and had looked at both roads and had chosen stillness because neither choice felt convenient. And Anne had waited. For 11 years, she had been so deeply ready to support, to manage, to absorb, to adjust, to smooth every rough edge, and fill every social gap, and be at all times the kind of wife who made a man's life easier than it deserved to be. She picked up Alexander Whitmore's most recent note from the corner of her desk and read it again. Better than I was and well are very rarely the same thing. But the first is how it always begins. She folded it. Set it in the drawer this time, rather than beneath the other correspondence. Then she got into bed and lay in the dark, and thought with a precision that surprised her about what it would mean to stop being ready for Frederick and begin being ready for herself. It felt enormous. It felt terrifying. It felt under all of that like something she was long overdue. Thursday came. Lady Castleton's drawing room was exactly what Anne needed. Warm, unhurried, full of women who had lived enough life to have stopped performing their opinions and simply held them quietly and without apology. There was Lady Forsyth, who was 70, and said everything she thought with the serene audacity of someone who had decided the social consequences were no longer worth managing. There was Mrs. Alderton, whose husband had died 6 years prior, and who had subsequently discovered with some surprise that she was considerably happier. There was young Mrs. Pennington, who was recently married and still in the process of discovering what she'd agreed to, and there was Alexander Whitmore, which was apparently now a recurring feature of Thursday gatherings, and which Lady Castleton's expression, serene, innocent, supremely self-satisfied, suggested was entirely by design. Anne caught her hostess's eye across the room. Lady Castleton smiled with the benevolent contentment of a woman who has decided she knows best and has so far proven herself correct. I was in conversation with Lord Forsyth when Anne arrived, and he noticed her entrance without turning. She could tell by the slight shift in his attention the way a person's posture changes when something in the room has claimed a portion of their awareness. When Lord Forsyth moved away, Alexander crossed the room. Not quickly, without urgency, the way he seemed to do everything. Lady Pembroke. A small bow. You look... He paused. The pause of someone who'd had the automatic compliment ready and had chosen honesty instead. You look like someone who has had a difficult week and is managing it with considerable style. Something loosened in her chest. That is the most accurate thing anyone has said to me since Saturday. I have a habit of accuracy. It's considered a social flaw in some circles. In mine as well. She accepted a cup of tea from a passing servant. Sit with me. They found a pair of chairs near the window, and the particular geography of Lady Castleton's drawing room arranged itself thoughtfully around them. Other guests drifting to other corners, conversations opening up the necessary space. Tell me something, Anne said. Why did you intervene at the garden party? You didn't know me. You had no obligation. He considered this with the seriousness it deserved. I've been asked that question before, in different forms. What do you usually answer? I usually say I acted on instinct. His gray eyes held hers. But I've been thinking since Saturday that instinct is another word for values sometimes. What you do when there's no time to deliberate is what you actually believe. And what do you believe? That a man who stands by while someone threatens his wife isn't confused or overwhelmed. He's made a choice whether he admits it or not. And that when someone makes that choice, someone else has to make a different one. He turned his cup in his hands. It didn't feel like a decision in the moment. It felt like the only possible response. Anne was quiet for a beat. Frederick said he hesitated because defending me publicly would have required making a statement about his priorities. Alexander said nothing. His expression didn't shift dramatically, but something in it tightened very slightly the way a man's face changes when he hears confirmation of something he'd suspected and had hoped was wrong. He said that to you. He did, last night. He was being honest, I think. Maybe for the first time in a long time. She looked at her tea. I've been trying to decide whether honesty offered that late is still worth something. What have you decided? That it's worth something, she said, but not everything. He nodded. No argument. No rush to offer a resolution she hadn't asked for. My mother, he said after a moment, used to say that a man reveals his character in the moments when staying silent is easier than speaking. Not in the grand gestures, not in the declarations. He set his cup down. In the small moments, the ones where no one would blame him for doing nothing. Your father, Anne said carefully, was he? How was a good man? Simple, direct. He was not always a brave one. There's a difference, and I watched my mother learn it, and I decided early that I would rather be the brave kind, even if I was sometimes wrong about what courage required. She looked at him for a long moment, at the steadiness in him, the absence of performance. He was not trying to impress her. He was not curating himself for her approval. He was simply present, honest, paying attention. You're a rather unusual man, Mr. Whitmore. So I've been told. A quiet dryness to it. Usually by people who mean it as a warning. I mean it as a compliment. Then I'll take it as one. A pause. How are you, honestly? Not fine. Not better than I was. How are you, Lady Pembroke? She thought about it seriously. She stopped. Started again. I'm in the middle of understanding something about my own life that I should have understood earlier. And the understanding is clarifying, but it's also a great deal to carry. I feel like someone who's been walking in the wrong direction and has just worked out they've been going wrong and now has to decide how far back to go before they can start going right. I was quiet for a moment. Then gently, you don't have to go back. You can turn from exactly where you are. The room continued around them. Lady Forsyth was holding forth on something that had everyone in her corner laughing. Mrs. Alderton was examining a piece of embroidery. Mrs. Pennington was listening to Lady Castleton with the focused attention of a woman collecting advice she intended to use. Anne sat with what Alexander had said and felt it settle into her like something solid. You don't have to go back. You can turn from exactly where you are. It was such a simple idea. She didn't know why it hadn't occurred to her. She'd spent so much energy examining the past where things had gone wrong when Frederick had stopped seeing her. Which moment had been the first real fracture, as though understanding the origin would somehow reverse the damage. But you couldn't reverse it. You could only choose what came next. The gathering wound through its natural hours, and Anne stayed later than she'd intended, and when she finally rose to leave, Alexander stood as well. May I walk you to your carriage, not presumptuous. An offer clearly stated as one easily refused. You may, she said. In the front hall, while her cloak was being fetched, he stood beside her in comfortable silence. Not the silence of people who have nothing to say. The silence of people who have said the important things and don't feel the need to fill the remaining space with lesser words. Lady Pembroke. His voice was quiet. Whatever you decide about your situation, about what comes next, I hope you decide it for yourself. Not for what's expected, and not out of habit. His eyes held hers for a moment. You deserve to make choices that are actually yours. Her cloak arrived. She accepted it. She allowed herself one full, honest look at him, at the steadiness, the clarity, the man who had stepped forward when no one else had moved. Thank you, she said, and meant it for considerably more than the evening. The ride home was quiet. She sat with her hands folded and watched the London streets move past, and she turned over everything that had happened in the past week, like smooth stones, feeling the weight and shape of each one. She thought about what Alexander had said about instinct and values, about what you do when there's no time to deliberate. What had Frederick done when there was no time to deliberate? He had hesitated. What had she done for 11 years when there was no time to deliberate? She had absorbed, adjusted, managed, stayed. What would she do now? She didn't have the full answer. She suspected the full answer was going to take time and require more courage than she'd had to exercise in a very long time. But the question itself felt new. Felt like something that belonged to her rather than to her marriage or her social standing, or the careful performance of being Frederick Pembroke's wife. The question felt like the beginning of something. She arrived home to find Frederick in the front hall. He'd been waiting. She could tell there was a quality to his stillness that was different from his usual settled comfort. He looked up when she came through the door. "You were out late." Not accusatory, something more uncertain. Lady Castleton's gathering ran long. She handed her cloak to the footman. "Was there something you needed?" "I've been thinking." He moved slightly. The posture she'd come to recognize as his version of vulnerability. Hands not quite at ease, jaw set in the way of a man who has rehearsed something and is now finding the words don't come as cleanly as they'd sounded in his head. "About what I said Tuesday night." She waited. "I said I wasn't ready." He looked at her directly now. Something in his eyes that was genuine, she thought, or wanted to be. "I've been sitting with that, and I think I owe you more than an explanation. I think I owe you an apology." "All right," she said evenly. "I'm sorry, Anne." He crossed toward her, stopped a few feet away as though some instinct had told him not to close the full distance unbidden. "For Saturday. For the hesitation. For not being where I should have been." She looked at him for a long, careful moment. The apology was real. She was almost certain of it. He meant those words in the way that people mean things when they've spent several days being genuinely uncomfortable with themselves and have finally arrived at the honest admission. "Thank you," she said, "for saying it." He waited. For something more, for the release of tension that usually came when he apologized, the warm reopening of the space between them. She'd always been good at that, at accepting, at meeting him halfway. She didn't offer it this time. "Is that—" He stopped. "Anne, I've apologized." "I know." She met his eyes. "And I believe you mean it. But an apology is the beginning of something, Frederick, not the end of it. You can't say sorry for standing still and then expect me to stand still as well." She picked up her gloves from the side table. "I need to think. I need time to process what's happened between us. What's been happening honestly for a good deal longer than last Saturday." "What does that mean, process?" "It means that I've been doing a great deal of thinking this week about who I am outside of being your wife, and I find I quite like her." She met his eyes steadily. "I think I'd like to spend more time with her." Frederick stared at her. Something had landed, she could see it land. Not just the words, but the quality behind them. The absence of the familiar yielding. "Who have you been talking to?" he asked. "Myself, mostly." She moved toward the stairs. "Good night, Frederick." She didn't look back. She climbed the stairs with the particular composed certainty of a woman who has said exactly what she meant and does not require the other person's agreement to stand by it. Behind her, she heard Frederick say her name once quietly. She did not stop. In her room, she went to her writing desk. She sat down. She took out a clean sheet of paper, and she did not write to Alexander Whitmore, because that was not what she needed tonight. She wrote to herself. Not in any formal way. Just words plainly set down, the kind you write when you need to look at your own thoughts outside of your head to understand whether they're real. "I have been Frederick Pembroke's wife for 11 years. I have been good at it. I have been so good at it that I lost track of whether there was anything else I was. There is. I'm beginning to remember what." She looked at what she'd written for a long time. Then she set the pen down and sat back and breathed. The house was quiet around her. The clock on the mantel marked time with its usual indifferent patience. Somewhere below, Frederick was probably still standing in the front hall, holding the apology he'd offered, and the silence she'd given back, trying to understand what had shifted. Something had shifted. That much was certain. Not dramatically, she had not packed a trunk, or delivered an ultimatum, or wept or raged. She had simply stopped accommodating. quietly, completely in the interior place where accommodation had always lived, and in the space where that had been something new was taking up residence. She didn't have a name for it yet. She suspected it was going to turn out to be something that had always belonged to her, something she'd set aside so many years ago that she'd nearly forgotten it was hers. Outside her window, London moved on in its ordinary nighttime way. Carriage wheels, distant voices, the indifferent machinery of a world that did not stop for private reckonings. Anne sat at her desk in the quiet, and in the quiet, she was already becoming someone Frederick was not going to recognize. And she was not. She realized, afraid of that. She was something much more unexpected. She was looking forward to it. The letter arrived on a Friday morning, and it was not addressed to Anne. She would not have seen it at all, except that Frederick had left it on the breakfast table carelessly, in the way of a man who has grown so accustomed to his wife's discretion that he no longer bothers to exercise his own. He'd been called away before breakfast by his solicitor, some urgent matter requiring his immediate presence, and he'd swept out of the house with the hurried energy of a man who had too many things happening at once and had stopped keeping track of which ones required concealment. Anne sat down with her tea. She did not intend to read it. She reached to move it aside to clear the space for her own correspondence, and her eyes caught 3 words at the top of the page before she could look away. "My dearest Frederick." She set her teacup down. She looked at the letter for a long moment. At the handwriting, elegant, deliberate, the penmanship of a woman who had been taught to write beautifully and knew it. At the salutation. At the particular tenderness of dearest, which was a word Anne could not remember her husband ever using in reference to her. She should not read it. She knew that. There were rules about such things, rules of privacy, rules of dignity. The particular rule that said, a woman who reads her husband's correspondence is inviting pain. She cannot then legitimately claim to be surprised by. She had already had all the pain, she thought. She might as well have the information. She read the letter. It took 4 minutes. She read it slowly, the way you read something when you need to be certain you're understanding it correctly and not simply seeing what you feared. She read certain passages twice. When she finished, she set it back on the table exactly as she'd found it. She folded her hands in her lap. She sat with the particular stillness of someone who has just had a large, heavy thing confirmed and needs a moment before she can assess the full weight of it. Victoria Langley had been corresponding with Frederick for 14 months, not in the vague, suggestion-laden way that society whispers implied. Not the ambiguous friendship that Frederick had presumably been prepared to defend if pressed. 14 months of letters. 14 months of my dearest. 14 months of language that left nothing to interpretation, that was precise in its affection and specific in its knowledge. Knowledge of Frederick's business dealings, his investment decisions, his concerns about the estate. Anne had advised Frederick on those same business dealings. She had sat across from him at that same breakfast table and offered her thoughts on the Harrington investment, on the solicitor's concerns about the northern properties, on the question of whether to sell the Derby shares. He had listened with the polite, slightly distracted attention of a man who appreciated input he didn't intend to act on, and then apparently had turned around and discussed all of it with Victoria Langley, who had advised him differently. That much was clear from the letter. The references to decisions made, strategies, reconsidered, the particular warmth of you, made the right choice as I knew you would. Choices he had made against Anne's counsel. Decisions she had watched him make and had thought privately were mistakes. Decisions that had troubled her enough to revisit more than once questions she had raised and been gently redirected away from. He had been taking Victoria's advice for over a year, on their estate, on their finances, on their life. Anne sat with this for exactly as long as she could afford to, which was not long, because the footman would appear shortly to clear the breakfast things, and she did not want witnesses to whatever expression was currently on her face. She stood. She walked to the window. She breathed. She was not going to cry. She had made a decision about crying several days ago, and she intended to honor it, because tears at this stage felt like she was grieving something she should have buried long ago, and she had spent enough time in mourning for a marriage that had apparently been quietly vacating itself for 14 months. What she felt underneath the initial shock was something colder and more clarifying. She felt the specific, clean anger of a woman who has finally found the full picture after years of looking at fragments. She thought of every piece of advice Frederick had not taken, every concern she had raised that he'd dismissed, every moment she'd questioned a decision and been told gently or not that she didn't have the full picture. She thought of the Derby shares sold against her recommendation at a loss she'd predicted almost to the figure. She thought of the investment in Harrington's northern venture, which she'd counseled caution on, and which Frederick had committed to heavily, and which was now, according to the solicitor's most recent report, performing considerably below expectation. Victoria had advised those moves. Victoria had encouraged them. And either Victoria was spectacularly bad at financial reasoning, which was possible, or the colder thought, the one that arrived last and sat heaviest. Victoria had advised them, knowing they were bad. Had encouraged Frederick to make choices that weakened the Pembroke estate. Had nudged him month by month toward decisions that isolated him from his wife's counsel and made him more dependent on hers. Anne pressed her fingers against the window frame and thought about that for a very long time. Then she went to her writing desk and wrote 2 letters. The first was to her solicitor, Mr. Hartley, requesting a private meeting at his offices at his earliest convenience. She worded it precisely with the specificity of someone who had spent 11 years managing correspondence and knew exactly how to convey urgency without alarm. The second was to Lady Castleton. Short. 3 lines. I've found something. I need your counsel and your discretion. Are you free this afternoon? She sealed both and gave them to the footman with instructions for immediate delivery. Then she sat and waited with the concentrated patience of someone who has made her decisions and is now managing the time until she can act on them. Lady Castleton's reply came within the hour. Come at 2. I'll have the good biscuits. She came at 2. Lady Castleton listened to everything. The letter, the 14 months, the financial decisions, the particular strategy. Anne had begun to piece together, with the focused, uninterrupted attention of a woman who understood that some conversations require absolute stillness. She didn't gasp. She didn't exclaim. She poured tea and she listened, and when Anne finished, she set down her cup and was quiet for a moment. How long have you known something was wrong? Not something was happening. Something was wrong. The distinction was deliberate, and Anne noticed it and felt a wave of gratitude for being spoken to with that precision. 2 years, Anne said. In the way you know without quite letting yourself know. I noticed things changing. The way he deferred certain conversations. The decisions that didn't make sense to me. I thought... She stopped. I thought I was losing my understanding of him. That we'd simply grown apart in the way that some couples do. I didn't think someone was... She stopped again. Engineering it, Lady Castleton said quietly. I don't know that for certain. No, but you suspect it. I think it's possible. Anne looked at her hands. I think it's possible that Victoria understood from the beginning that Frederick would never willingly dismantle his marriage. That he is the kind of man who takes the path of least resistance, who avoids direct choices by allowing situations to simply evolve. She looked up. If you wanted Frederick Pembroke, you wouldn't confront his wife. You'd simply make yourself indispensable and make his wife seem unnecessary, Lady Castleton finished. Or worse. Anne's voice was even, completely controlled. You'd make her advice seem wrong, her judgment unreliable. You'd encourage him to make decisions she opposed, and then position yourself as the one who'd understood better. She paused. You'd isolate him from the one person whose counsel he should have trusted, and you'd do it so gradually he'd never notice he was being managed. Lady Castleton was very still. Anne, have you spoken to Hartley yet? I've written. He'll see me Monday. Good. The older woman leaned forward. Listen to me carefully. What you've described, if it's what we think, goes considerably beyond a husband's infidelity. This touches your inheritance, your security. She held Anne's gaze. Your future independent of what Frederick decides to do or not do. You need to understand exactly what's been moved, sold, or committed to in the last 14 months. I know. Anne pressed her hands flat on her knees. The gesture of someone containing something that wants to expand beyond its allotted space. I know. And you need to do this quietly, before Frederick knows you know, because the moment he knows everything becomes reactive, emotional, hard to manage. I understand. Do you? Lady Castleton's eyes were kind, but they were also very direct. Because right now what you know is making you angry as it should, and anger is clarifying up to a point, and then it makes you act before you're ready. Don't act before you're ready. Anne breathed. Once. Deliberately. I have spent 11 years not acting before I was ready. I think I may have overcorrected in that direction. There's a middle ground between a decade of patience and burning the house down on a Tuesday. Lady Castleton's tone was dry, but not unkind. Find it. Something almost like a smile moved across Anne's mouth. You are the most useful person I know. I know. Lady Castleton sat back. Now, what about Mr. Whitmore? Anne looked up. Don't give me that expression. I'm 63 years old, and I have been watching two people talk to each other for a fortnight. What about him? Anne started. He's been kind. He's been considerably more than kind, and we both know it, and the question is, what you intend to do about it. Lady Castleton refilled both their cups with the calm efficiency of a woman for whom directness is a time-saving device. He's asked after you, you know, not in an improper way. In the way of a man who is trying very hard to be proper about something he's finding it difficult to be proper about. Anne was quiet. He's a good man, Lady Castleton continued. Not perfect, not without his own complications, but genuinely good in the way that Frederick is not in the way that involves actually seeing the person in front of him. She paused. I think you've noticed that. It's not. Anne stopped. The situation is not simple, no. But it's also not as complicated as you're making it. You're still married. That matters. And you are also a woman who is beginning to understand her own worth, and that matters too. Lady Castleton met her eyes. Those two things can exist at the same time without you having to resolve them this afternoon. Anne nodded. Slowly. One thing at a time, Lady Castleton said. Hartley first. Your finances, your security, your standing. Establish those. Build the foundation before you think about what you want to build on top of it. You make it sound architectural. Everything worth doing is architectural, darling. You don't start with the roof. Anne left Lady Castleton's at 4. She rode home with her hands folded and her mind very busy, and she did not let herself think about Alexander Whitmore, because Lady Castleton was right, and she knew it one thing at a time. But she thought about him anyway for exactly 2 minutes, in the particular involuntary way of someone who has decided not to think about a thing, and discovered the decision has no authority over the mind. She thought about what Lady Castleton had said. He sees the person in front of him. She thought about the Thursday gathering and the 2 chairs by the window and the particular quality of being with someone who did not require her to be smaller than she was. Then she put it away and thought about Hartley and the accounts and what she needed to know before Monday. Frederick was home when she returned. He met her in the front hall with the look of a man who has been waiting, not impatiently, but with the accumulated awareness of someone who has had a long afternoon with his thoughts and has not been entirely comfortable. You were at Lady Castleton's, he said. I was. His eyes moved over her face. He stopped. You seem different. Do I? Since Saturday, since this week. He moved to stand closer. Anne, I need to know that he searched for the word. That we're managing this. She looked at him. She thought about the letter still sitting on the breakfast table, which she had returned to exactly its original position, and which Frederick had presumably collected at some point during the day. And she thought about 14 months of my dearest. And she thought about Lady Castleton's voice. Don't act before you're ready. We are managing, she said. I'm managing very well. Something in his expression relaxed, and that relaxing told her everything about what he'd been afraid she might say. He believed her. That was Frederick. He believed what was convenient to believe because the alternative required him to look at something he wasn't ready to look at. Ready. That word again. Good, he said. He put a hand on her arm. I am sorry, Anne. I want you to know I mean that. I know, she said. She held very still under his hand. "I know you do." She went upstairs and sat at her desk and opened the account ledger she kept herself. The household accounts, the quarterly summaries, the careful records she'd maintained since the first year of their marriage, because she had always understood that knowing where the money went was the foundation of understanding how a household actually functioned. She went back 14 months. She looked at the numbers with the focused, methodical attention of a woman who was good with numbers and had learned to be better. What she found was not dramatic. There was no single large withdrawal, no obvious moment of crisis. It was quieter than that, and therefore more sophisticated. Small shifts. A pattern of decisions that individually looked reasonable and collectively traced a shape she recognized. The Derby shares sold in October. Frederick had told her they'd gotten a fair price. She checked the figure. They had not gotten a fair price. They'd sold at a 12% loss in a market that had recovered within the month. The Harrington investment committed in January, she checked the amount. More than Frederick had told her. Significantly more. The figure he'd quoted her when she'd questioned the decision was not the figure in the ledger. She turned pages. She went back further to before Victoria's letters, looking for the baseline, looking for where the drift had started. She found it. The exact point where Frederick's financial decisions had begun to diverge from their historical pattern. The month they'd begun moving in a direction that was not catastrophic. Not yet. But consistently, methodically wrong. The month she noted with the cold clarity of someone counting that aligned almost exactly with the beginning of 14 months of correspondence. She closed the ledger. She sat back. She had the shape of it now. Not all the details Hartley would help her with those, but the shape was clear enough. Victoria had not simply pursued a married man. She had pursued a married man's household, his finances, his decision-making. She had made herself the trusted voice in Frederick's ear and had used that position to turn the word over. Weaken seemed too simple. Destabilize was closer. To gradually, incrementally move the pieces of the Pembroke estate into positions that served some purpose Anne couldn't fully see yet. The question was why. The obvious answer was Frederick himself, that Victoria wanted him, and the estate was incidental damage, the cost of occupying a married man's attention. But something in the systematic quality of it nagged at Anne. This was too careful for impulse, too consistent for mere distraction. She took out a fresh piece of paper and wrote down everything she knew. Every decision, every date, every figure that didn't match. She wrote for an hour without stopping, building the picture piece by piece. And when she was done, she looked at what she'd written and understood that she was looking at something that required a lawyer, not just a concerned wife. She was going to need Hartley sooner than Monday. She wrote him again, this time without softening the urgency. The following morning was Saturday, and it brought Alexander Whitmore to Lady Castleton's morning walk, an informal thing. Apparently a tradition in certain social circles she'd been adjacent to, but not fully part of, and Lady Castleton, continuing her campaign of engineered coincidence with remarkable consistency, had mentioned it to Anne late on Friday, with the casual tone of someone remarking on the weather. Anne went. She told herself she went because she needed air and company, and the particular steadiness of Lady Castleton's presence. This was partially true. Alexander was already there when she arrived in conversation with Lord Forsyth about something agricultural. He turned when she approached, and his expression did the thing it had started doing, the settling the arrival, the look of a man who has been slightly waiting without being fully aware of it. Lady Pembroke, Mr. Whitmore. She matched his quiet. How are you this morning? Better than yesterday, he said. And yourself? The same, I think. She fell into step beside him as the small group began the walk. I've had a complicated week. I heard something of it. At her glance, he clarified. Lady Castleton mentioned in the general way of things that you had matters requiring your attention. She didn't elaborate. A pause. She didn't need to. You have the look of someone who's found out something they needed to know and is now figuring out what to do with it. Is that what I look like? To me. His voice was low, just for her. You have a clarity about you. When you've decided something, it shows. Not dramatically, but it's there. She considered that. What does it look like when I haven't decided something? Like this morning, he said without unkindness. Still deciding. She laughed, short and genuine, the unexpected kind. Several people ahead of them turned, and she realized it had been a while since anyone nearby had heard her laugh. You're very observant. Occupational habit. I manage my own estate without agents. You learn to read situations quickly when the consequences of misreading them are immediate. Do you ever misread them? Regularly. No hesitation. I try to correct quickly when I do. They walked for a moment in companionable quiet. The rest of the group spread ahead and behind in clusters of conversation. The kind of social arrangement that gives two people the useful illusion of privacy. May I ask you something? Anne kept her voice easy, conversational. Always. Victoria Langley. What do you know about her? Genuinely, not gossip. Facts. A slight pause. He was weighing something, not whether to answer, she thought, but how to answer honestly without overstepping. Her father was Edward Langley. He died 4 years ago, leaving the family in somewhat reduced circumstances, not ruined, but diminished. Her brother managed the remaining properties, but not well. There's debt from what I understand. Not public knowledge, but the kind of thing that surfaces in certain conversations. He looked at her steadily. She's been strategic in her social movements since her father's death, looking for footholds. She's clever. Anne absorbed this carefully. Strategic in what direction? Marriage, most assumed. But she's bypassed 2 reasonable opportunities in the last 3 years. He paused, which made some people wonder. What did it make you wonder? That she wasn't looking for a husband. He held her gaze. She was looking for leverage. The word landed with the precision of something true. Anne walked for a moment without speaking. The pieces were arranging themselves into a clearer shape. Victoria's family's debt, Victoria's access to Frederick's financial decisions, Victoria's consistent advice toward choices that weakened the Pembroke position. If someone wanted to acquire a property, Anne said carefully, or a stake in an estate in a way that didn't require purchasing it outright, they'd need the current owner to be in a sufficiently weakened position to need capital. Alexander's voice was very quiet now. Or to need rescue, and they'd need the current owner to trust them enough to accept that rescue. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. And they'd need the wife out of the way. Because a wife who manages the accounts is a wife who would notice. Anne stopped walking. He stopped beside her. The Pembroke estate, she said carefully. The northern properties, the Harrington investment. The Harrington venture has 2 primary backers, Alexander said. Pembroke is one. The other is a holding company. He looked at her directly. I looked into it because Harrington approached me as well, and I declined, and I was curious about who'd agreed. The holding company resolves eventually to a family trust. A pause. The Langley Family Trust. Anne felt the full shape of it arrive at once. Victoria hadn't been pursuing Frederick. She'd been purchasing the Pembroke estate, slowly. Through his own decisions, financed with his own money, with his own enthusiastic participation, while his wife stood across the breakfast table and offered advice he'd been trained over 14 months to dismiss. Anne turned and looked at Alexander. How long have you known this? I worked it out 4 days ago. His expression was level. I wasn't certain you were aware. I was trying to determine how to tell you without it being something I had no right to say. You had every right. You're a married woman with a complicated situation. I didn't want to be the man who told me the truth. She held his gaze. I would rather have the truth from someone who has no obligation to give it than comfortable silence from someone who does. I've had enough comfortable silence. He looked at her for a moment. I'm sorry. I should have told you sooner. You're telling me now. She steadied herself. I have a meeting with my solicitor on Monday. Hartley. You know him. By reputation. He's good. A pause. If it would be useful, I have some documentation regarding the Harrington venture. Nothing that isn't legitimately obtainable, but gathered more quickly than your solicitor might manage independently. You could have it Monday morning before your meeting. Anne looked at him. At this man who had stepped forward in her rose walk when no one else moved, who had written careful, honest notes, who had spent the last week apparently quietly investigating the financial architecture of her husband's betrayal and was now offering her the results. "Why are you doing this?" The question came out more nakedly than she'd intended. Any of it. He considered it. Not as a performance, but genuinely the way he seemed to consider everything. Because the right thing when you see it isn't complicated, even when the situation around it is. He met her eyes. And because you deserve someone. Not me necessarily. Not anyone in particular. Just the experience of someone being in your corner without requiring anything in return. He paused. You seem like you haven't had that in a long time. Anne breathed. No, she said quietly. I haven't. They stood there for a moment, and the morning moved around them, and Lady Castleton was somewhere ahead, pretending not to have arranged any of this. The documentation, Anne said, pulling herself back to the practical, because the practical was where she could function right now, while the rest was still too large to fully look at. Yes, please, I'd be grateful. I'll send it tomorrow. He paused. Anne. The name, her name, not her title, arrived quietly without fanfare, just a shift in register that was somehow enormous. You're going to be all right. She looked at him. You sound certain of that. I am. No hesitation. Whatever happens with Frederick, whatever this turns out to be, you are more capable than this situation deserves. I've been watching you manage it, and I've been... He stopped himself, chose his next words. I've been impressed. She thought she might cry suddenly, and without warning, and she was absolutely not going to do that on a Saturday morning walk with Lady Castleton in the vicinity. She gathered herself with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had been gathering herself for a very long time. Thank you, she said, for all of it. He nodded. And then he offered his arm in the natural, uncomplicated way of escorting someone back to the group, and she took it, and they walked back into the company of other people. And somewhere in the Pembroke household, Frederick was sitting at breakfast, with no idea that his wife had spent the last week quietly uncovering the full architecture of a betrayal that was considerably larger than an infidelity. He would find out. That was coming. Anne could feel it approaching with the inevitability of weather large and certain, and not yet arrived. She was going to be ready for it. For the first time in 11 years, she was going to be ready for exactly what came next, because she had built it herself, piece by piece in the space her husband had left when he'd chosen to stop looking. And when that moment came, Anne Montgomery Pembroke was not going to hesitate. Hartley's offices smelled of old paper and careful thought, which Anne had always found reassuring. There was something honest about a room that looked like work had actually happened in it. She arrived at 9 on Monday morning with Alexander's documentation under her arm, and 11 years of suppressed clarity behind her eyes. Hartley met her himself at the door, a small, precise man in his 60s, who had managed the Montgomery family's legal affairs since before Anne's father died, and who looked at her now with the particular alertness of someone who had read her Friday letter twice and understood it was not a social call. Lady Pembroke. He ushered her in. Sit down, please. I've had the accounts pulled. She sat. She put Alexander's documents on the desk between them. These first, she said. Then the accounts. Hartley looked at the documents. He read carefully the methodical, unhurried reading of a man who understood that speed in this context was a form of carelessness. He turned pages. His expression did not change dramatically, which told Anne he was finding confirmation rather than surprise, which meant his own preliminary review of the accounts had already pointed him somewhere similar. When he finished, he set the documents down and folded his hands. How did you obtain these? A friend. Someone with access to the Harrington Ventures registration documents and the good sense to read them carefully. She met his eyes. Are they accurate? They are consistent with what I've found in the estate accounts. He paused. Lady Pembroke, I need to ask you directly, how much do you know about what's been happening with the Pembroke holdings over the last 14 months? Tell me what you know, she said, and I'll tell you where it matches mine. He told her. It was worse than she'd calculated, and she had calculated badly, which told her something about how unwilling some part of her had been to see the full scope. The Harrington investment was not simply underperforming. The structure of the agreement was such that if the venture failed to meet its targets by year's end, which it was currently on course to do, Pembroke's stake would be forfeit, not returned at a loss. Forfeit. Absorbed into the venture's remaining assets, which were held in trust by the other primary backer, the Langley Family Trust. She sat with that for a moment. If the Harrington venture fails, Pembroke loses the entire Northern investment, approximately 22% of the estate's liquid holdings. Hartley's voice was precise, the voice of a man delivering information he wishes he didn't have. Additionally, the Derby sale was conducted below market value in a manner that suggests the buyer had advanced knowledge of the timing. The buyer was a private party transaction handled through an intermediary. He paused. I am still untangling the intermediary. You'll find the Langley Trust at the end of it, Anne said. Hartley looked at her steadily. Quite possibly. Is any of this illegal? He considered this with appropriate care. Potentially actionable in some aspects. The Harrington Agreement's forfeiture clause is unusual. It could be challenged as unconscionable if the right argument were made and the right judge were found. He leaned back slightly. The more immediate question is whether it can be prevented from triggering in the first place. How? By pulling Pembroke's investment before year's end. The agreement has an exit provision narrow with financial penalties, but it exists. He looked at her. Your husband would need to act on it within the next 6 weeks. My husband, Anne said carefully, is currently unaware of the full picture. Yes, Hartley did not editorialize. I gathered. If he were made aware, she stopped. He would need to confront Victoria Langley, publicly or privately, but directly, and he would need to accept that he'd been, she found the word, managed, for over a year, by someone he trusted. Yes, that will be difficult for him. Most necessary things are. Hartley's voice was not unsympathetic. Lady Pembroke, this is your decision to make how and when and whether your husband is informed. You have some standing to act independently on certain matters, given the Montgomery inheritance provisions your father included in the marriage settlement. I'd want to review those carefully before advising further, but I want you to understand something. He held her gaze. Whatever choices you make here about the estate, about your marriage, those choices will have consequences that follow you. You deserve to make them with full information and without time pressure. Which is why we are having this conversation now. She left Hartley's offices at 11:30 with 3 things: a clearer picture of exactly what was at stake, a list of immediate actions she had the legal standing to initiate on her own, and the particular settled calm of a woman who has finally stopped being managed by events and started managing them herself. She thought in the carriage home about how to tell Frederick, not whether. She had settled that. He had to know, not for his sake, though that was a consideration, but because the estate's financial recovery required his active participation, and because she was not going to save his inheritance from behind a curtain while he remained comfortably unaware. That was the old Anne, the one who managed everything quietly so that Frederick could remain at ease. This Anne was going to sit across from her husband and put 11 years on the table and let him look at it in full light. She arrived home. She went to her desk. She spent an hour organizing her notes into a clear sequential account, not emotional, not accusatory, but precise. Facts in order. Figures with dates. The shape of it laid out so that a man of reasonable intelligence could follow it without being guided. Then she went to find Frederick. How was in the study? The afternoon paper spread across his knee, a glass of afternoon port on the side table. The specific, comfortable arrangement of a man who believes his life is in order. He looked up when she entered and immediately registered something in her face. Anne. He sat forward slightly. What's wrong? She closed the study door. She sat across from him, not on the adjacent settee, where she usually sat, but in the chair directly opposite the one usually reserved for his solicitor and business visitors. She placed her notes on the knee of her dress. I need to talk to you about the estate, she said, and about Victoria Langley, and I need you to listen without interrupting until I've finished. The port glass went down. Anne. Without interrupting, she repeated, "Please." He looked at her face. Whatever he saw there, it was enough. He sat back. He nodded. She talked for 20 minutes. She did not rush. She did not soften. She did not perform emotion because she had moved past the stage where emotion was the primary thing she felt about this. What she felt now was something closer to clarity, the particular clear-eyed focus of someone who has mapped a problem fully and is now presenting the map. She told him about the letter, about the 14 months of correspondence, about the pattern she'd found in the accounts and what Hartley had confirmed that morning, about the Harrington Investments forfeiture clause and where that money would go when the clause triggered, about the Derby shares and the intermediary that Hartley was still untangling, but that she suspected would resolve to the same source. She told him what Victoria Langley's family finances looked like and what purpose the Pembroke estate's strategic weakening served. She laid it out without drama, fact by fact, the way you lay cards on a table when you want someone to see the hand that's been played against them. When she finished, Frederick was very still. Not the stillness of a man who is calm. The stillness of a man who has just absorbed something large and hasn't yet worked out how to move under the weight of it. "You're saying," he started, then stopped. "You're telling me that Victoria has been advising you toward decisions that directly benefit the Langley family trust at the expense of our estate?" "Yes." Anne kept her voice level. "I'm telling you that for 14 months while I raised concerns that you set aside, someone else was in your ear offering different counsel, and that different counsel was not disinterested." The silence was enormous. I trusted her. It came out quietly, raw in a way she hadn't heard from him before. Not the managed discomfort of a man caught in embarrassment, but something underneath that, the genuine stripped-back pain of a man confronting the fact that his faith had been a tool. "I know what you thought. No cruelty in it, but no softening either. And I understand that what I'm describing is difficult to accept. About yourself, about your own judgment." He looked at her then, really looked with the sudden desperate attention of someone who has been seeing carelessly for a long time and has just realized the cost. "You knew, before this. You tried to tell me." "I tried to tell you about the investments, about the Derby shares, about the Harrington commitment." She held his gaze. "You told me I didn't have the full picture." Frederick put his hand over his eyes, a gesture she had never seen him make. "God. You were getting your picture from someone who was editing it carefully," she said. "She's clever, Frederick. I want to be fair about that. What she did, it was patient, and it was systematic, and it was done so gradually that you would have had to be looking for it to find it. You weren't looking." "I should have been." He dropped his hand, looked at her. "I should have..." He stopped, tried again. "I should have been looking at you. I was looking at the wrong..." He stopped. "Yes." No recrimination, just the fact. "You were." "Anne." His voice cracked on her name just slightly, but it was there, and she heard it. I don't have a way to..." "There's no adequate response to this, Frederick." She set her notes on the desk between them. "Not today. What there is today is a decision. A practical one. There are 6 weeks before the Harrington forfeiture clause triggers. Hartley has outlined an exit provision with financial penalties that are significant but survivable. If you act on it, if you pull the investment now, accept the penalties, and pursue the questions around the Derby sale, you lose money, but you keep the estate's foundation intact." He stared at the notes. "And if I don't, Victoria Langley's family trust absorbs 22% of your liquid holdings, and then depending on what Hartley finds in the Derby intermediary, potentially more." She paused. "What you do about your relationship with her, that's a separate question. One only you can answer." He looked up sharply. "There is no relationship. Not now. Not after. I believe you." And she did. She could see it on his face, the particular collapse of a man who has discovered that what he'd thought was private affection was in fact an investment strategy. "But you need to understand something, Frederick." He waited. My telling you this, my coming to you with Hartley's findings and Alexander's documents and 2 weeks of my own careful work. This is the last time I do this. The last time I manage something you should have managed and deliver it to you, cleaned up and organized and ready to act on. She held his gaze steadily. I have spent 11 years being the person who noticed things and fixed things and smoothed things and was thanked for none of it and dismissed when it was inconvenient. I am telling you about Victoria because the estate is also my life, and I will not watch it dismantled on my watch. Not because it is my duty to save you from the consequences of your own choices. Frederick was very quiet. Are you leaving me? The question arrived bluntly, more bluntly than she'd expected, as though it had escaped before he could dress it properly. And she sat with it honestly, turning it over. I don't know, she said. That's the most honest answer I have. Anne, I'm not saying it to wound you. She leaned forward slightly. I'm saying it because it's true. I have been so fixed on being your wife, on being good at it, on managing it, on making it work, that I have not allowed myself to ask whether it is working for me. And I've started asking. And what have you found? I've found that I'm more than this. More than I've been permitted to be in this marriage. And that some of what's been missing is your fault, and some of it is mine, and some of it... She paused. Some of it was engineered by a woman who understood that a wife with full confidence in her own standing is much harder to displace than one who's been gradually made to feel uncertain. Frederick absorbed this. She watched him take it in piece by piece, the way a man absorbs information that reconstructs the recent past into something unrecognizable. She undermined you too. Every time you dismissed my advice, you did it slightly more easily. Every time you chose her judgment over mine, it cost me something I could not quite name. She looked at her hands. I didn't realize how much had accumulated until I was standing in the rose walk and you didn't move. He flinched, visibly physically. I've replayed that moment every day since it happened. So have I. She met his eyes. And the version where you stepped forward, I've thought about that version too, about what would have been different. And I think... She stopped. I think by the time we got to that garden, we had already lost something that would have made you step forward. The instinct to protect. The habit of choosing me. She paused. That didn't disappear overnight, Frederick. It eroded. And it was helped along. He stood up, moved to the window. His back to her, the familiar posture, and then as though he caught himself, he turned back around. I'm not going to stand at the window, he said quietly. That's what I do when I don't want to face something. Something very small and complicated moved through her chest. I know. I am sorry. He crossed toward her, stopped 2 feet away, the uncertain distance of a man who doesn't know if he's welcome closer. For the garden, for the investments, for every time I chose the easier thing when the right thing was standing right in front of me. His voice was unsteady in a way she'd never heard. For not seeing what was being done to you, to us. For being exactly the kind of man someone like Victoria could use, because I was too comfortable to look carefully at anything. Anne looked up at him, at the man she'd married, at the genuine anguish on his face. I believe that too, she said. I believe you mean all of it. But... He heard it in her voice before she said it. But an apology is the beginning of something, not the resolution of it. She stood so they were level, so she was not looking up at him. You've apologized. I've heard you. And now you need to act on the Harrington investment, on whatever Hartley finds about Derby, on the choices that come next. She held his gaze. And I need time. To figure out who I am when I'm not spending all my energy holding this household together while my husband isn't looking. Are you going somewhere? Not today. She stepped past him toward the door. But I'm not going to be the same person I was last month, Frederick. And you're going to have to decide whether the person I'm becoming is someone you actually want beside you. Not someone you've simply grown accustomed to having around. She paused at the door. That's a real question. One that deserves a real answer. She left him there. And this time, the leaving felt different from every other leaving she'd done this week. Not retreat, not escape. Forward motion. The particular directed momentum of a woman who has said exactly what needed saying and is walking toward whatever comes next. The following 3 days were charged with the particular electricity of a household on the edge of something. Frederick met with Hartley on Tuesday. He came home from that meeting quieter than she'd ever seen him and went directly to the study where he stayed for 2 hours. When he emerged, he found Anne in the sitting room. "I've instructed Hartley to initiate the exit from Harrington," he said from the doorway. "The penalties are," he exhaled, "significant. But he's right that they're survivable." Anne set down her correspondence. "Good. He's also found the Derby intermediary." A pause. "You were correct. It resolves to the Langley Trust." "I see. He's preparing a formal letter to Victoria's solicitor, putting her on notice that we're aware of the irregularities." His jaw was tight. "I've also sent my own letter. To Victoria. Ending all contact." He moved into the room, stood. "She hasn't replied. I don't expect she will." He looked at Anne steadily. "I want you to know I don't feel deceived in the way that should prompt you to feel sorry for me. I feel," he searched, "ashamed that I made it so easy, that I was so willing to be flattered and accommodated that I didn't question what it was costing. That took some courage to say. It shouldn't have required courage. It should have been obvious." He sat down. Not in his usual chair, in the chair across from her. The deliberate mirroring she realized of how she'd sat across from him in the study, facing her. Can I ask you something?" She waited. "Whitmore." He said the name carefully. "How involved has he been in all of this?" She considered her answer. "He provided documentation that helped Hartley's work. He's been a source of genuine support." She met Frederick's eyes. "He's been frankly more present in the last 2 weeks than you've been in the last 2 years. Frederick held her gaze without flinching. "Do you have feelings for him?" The question was quiet, serious. The question of a man who has decided to look directly at things he'd rather not see. Anne sat with it honestly. "I have tremendous regard for him, and an awareness that he—" She stopped. Chose precision. "He showed me something. Not about him particularly. About what it feels like to be seen by someone who's paying genuine attention. And I'd forgotten what that felt like, Frederick. I'd been without it for long enough that I'd stopped expecting it." She looked at her husband steadily. "That is not his failing. Or mine. It is ours." Frederick was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was even, effortful in its evenness. "Do you want to pursue that?" She shook her head slowly. "That's not the right question. The right question is whether this marriage you and I is something that can be made real again. Genuinely real. Not managed. Not performed." She held his gaze. "And I don't know the answer to that. I don't think either of us can know yet. We'd have to try. Actually try, not assume that an apology and a few good weeks resets 11 years. I know." He looked at his hands. "I know that. Do you?" She kept her voice gentle but direct. "Because you tend to believe that named intentions are the same as enacted ones. That deciding to be different is the same as being different. It isn't, Frederick. The difference is in the daily choices, the small moments." She thought of what Alexander had said about instinct and values, about what you do when there's no time to deliberate. "I need to see you make different choices, not once, consistently, over time." "And if I do, then we'll see," she said. "That's all I can offer. I won't pretend to certainty I don't have." He nodded. It was the nod of a man accepting terms he would once have found unacceptable and finding in accepting them something that was almost relief. The relief of finally dealing with reality instead of the more comfortable version he'd been constructing. Is there anything I can do now, today?" He looked at her with the earnest, slightly lost expression of a man who has discovered he must rebuild something and doesn't yet know where the materials are kept. She thought about it. "Come to dinner," she said. "Be present. Talk to me not about the estate, or the solicitor, or Victoria. Talk to me." She paused. "Tell me something true." He looked at her for a moment. "I've missed you," he said. Not the version of you that I'd trained myself to take for granted. You, the person I married." His voice was unsteady. "I've been sitting across from you for years and not arriving, not fully, and I didn't know how much I'd lost until someone else noticed," Anne said quietly. "Yes." She stood. "Come to dinner at 7 then." She moved toward the door. "And Frederick." He looked up. "The next time someone suggests a financial decision that contradicts what your wife has advised." She held his gaze. "You think about this week, and you choose differently." She left him sitting in the chair that faced where she'd been, and she went upstairs, and she sat at her vanity, and she looked at herself for a long time. She looked different. That was the strange thing. Objectively, the same face, same hair, same hands folded in the same lap. But something in the quality of her gaze had changed, the particular quality of someone who had stopped waiting for permission. She reached for the small drawer where she kept Alexander's notes. She sat with them in her hand for a moment without opening them. She would need to see him, to tell him what had happened, to thank him for the documentation, and to what? That was the question she was not yet ready to answer. The question that lived on the far side of everything she was currently managing in a country she could see from where she stood, but had not yet arrived at. She trusted him. That was clean and clear. She trusted his steadiness, his honesty, the absence of performance in everything he'd done. She trusted the man who had stepped forward in the rose walk without being asked, and had not once in the week since required anything of her in return. She thought of what he'd said on the Saturday walk. "You can turn from exactly where you are." She was turning. She could feel it, the slow, deliberate pivot of a woman finding her true direction. She did not yet know exactly where that direction led. But she knew this: it led forward. Away from 11 years of making herself small enough to fit inside someone else's inattention. Away from the careful management of a man who had not known what he had until someone else started showing him. Toward something she'd been building quietly and without fully knowing it in every choice she'd made in the last 2 weeks. Every honest word. Every refusal to accommodate. Every time she'd looked at herself in the mirror and recognized faintly at first, and then with increasing certainty, the woman she'd been before she'd learned to disappear. Dinner was at 7. Frederick arrived in the dining room before her, which he had not done in longer than she could easily count. He stood when she entered. It was a small thing, an ordinary automatic gesture of courtesy. But in its unexpectedness, in the visible deliberateness of a man who was choosing moment by moment to pay attention, it arrived with more weight than any grand declaration. She sat. He sat. The candles between them were the same candles as always. "Tell me something true," she said. He looked at her across the table, and he began to speak. Anne listened, with the careful, full attention she'd always been capable of when someone earned it, with the open, evaluating intelligence of a woman who was no longer simply his wife, but something more complicated and more complete than that, a woman deciding one dinner at a time what came next. Outside London moved on. Somewhere across the city, Alexander Whitmore was spending his evening without knowing he had given her without ever intending to the thing she'd needed most. Not rescue, not replacement, a mirror. Clear and honest and unsparing, in which she had finally, after 11 years, seen herself correctly. And what she'd seen there, strong, capable, clear-eyed, and not yet finished becoming, was a woman worth fighting for. She intended to do exactly that, starting with herself. 6 months is long enough to rebuild a foundation. It is not always long enough to know whether what you've built will hold. Anne understood this, the way she understood most things, now clearly, without the softening she'd once applied to truths that were inconvenient. She had spent the first 2 months after that Tuesday dinner watching Frederick with the careful, evaluating attention of a woman who had learned that intentions and actions lived in different countries, and that the distance between them was where marriages either recovered or quietly finished dying. He tried. She gave him that without reservation. He came to dinner. He asked questions and listened to the answers. He stopped retreating to the window when conversations grew difficult. He sat across from her in the chair that faced her, and he looked at her with the earnest, slightly effortful attention of a man who has realized too late that seeing someone is a skill, and that skills require practice. It wasn't enough. Not immediately. Not for a long time. But it was real. That was the thing she hadn't expected, that his effort would be genuine. She had braced for performance for the version of change that lasts 3 weeks and then graduates back to the comfortable original. What she got instead was something slower and less polished. Frederick stumbling through conversations he'd been avoiding for years. Frederick asking in December whether she'd been happy, not as a rhetorical device, not as a preamble to something else, but as a direct question that he visibly needed an honest answer to. She'd told him the truth. There were years when I was. She'd held his gaze. And years when I was managing so hard that I couldn't tell the difference. He'd nodded, said nothing. Later that evening, she'd found him in the study with the account ledgers open, cross-referencing figures with Hartley's report, doing the work himself for the first time in as long as she could remember. That was Frederick's version of response, not eloquence, but action. She was learning to read it. The Harrington exit had cost them, but Hartley had navigated it as well as anyone could have. The penalties were absorbed, the stake recovered before the forfeiture clause triggered, and whatever Victoria Langley had expected to receive from the collapse of that investment was denied to her. Completely. Cleanly. With a legal letter that made Hartley's position, and by extension, the Pembroke estate's position, absolutely clear. Victoria had not replied. She'd left London by November, which Lady Castleton reported with the satisfied certainty of a woman who had watched justice arrange itself correctly. The Langley family's financial situation untangled by Hartley. Over the following weeks turned out to be considerably worse than even Anne had estimated. The strategy patient sophisticated, built over 14 months, had required the Pembroke investment to fail on a precise timeline to rescue the Langley Trust's own collapsing position. When the exit was executed and the forfeiture denied, that timeline collapsed. Whatever had been planned fell apart with it. Anne did not feel triumphant about this. She felt accurate, as though the world had recalibrated to a truer position, and the satisfaction was not in Victoria's failure, but in the restoration of something that should never have been tampered with. January brought the kind of cold that made London feel like a city holding its breath. Anne had taken to spending Tuesday mornings at Hartley's offices, reviewing the quarterly accounts herself, with his guidance, not because it was strictly necessary, but because she had discovered that she was very good at it, and that the discovery had arrived in her like a key turning in a lock she'd forgotten she had. Hartley never treated her knowledge as surprising. He simply worked with it the way he would with anyone who came to him prepared. She appreciated that more than she could easily say. She was there on a particular Tuesday in January, when Hartley looked up from the papers and said with the careful directness she'd come to rely on, "Lady Pembroke, have you given any thought to the Montgomery Trust provisions, the ones your father included in the marriage settlement?" She had. She'd thought about them considerably. "Tell me what you think they mean." "They mean," Hartley said, setting down his pen, "that a significant portion of what you brought into this marriage remains legally yours. Independent of the Pembroke estate, independent of your husband's decisions." He held her gaze. "Your father was a careful man." How was? She felt something move through her, something that was gratitude and grief at once for a father who had loved her well enough to think about this. He always said the most important thing a man could give his daughter was the ability to stand on her own ground. He gave you that. Hartley paused. Whether or not you've needed to use it. She looked at the papers in front of her, at the figures that were hers, genuinely, unambiguously hers. At the foundation her father had quietly built for her 20 years ago, in the margins of a marriage settlement in case she ever needed it. "I want to understand it completely," she said. "All of it, every provision." "That," Hartley said, and something in his precise, careful face shifted fractionally toward warmth, "is exactly the right instinct." She spent February learning the full architecture of her own financial standing, and what she found was this: she was not dependent. She had never been dependent technically, though she had lived as though she were, because the habit of dependency is its own kind of blindness. You stop looking for the door because you've convinced yourself there isn't one. There was a door. Her father had built it. She simply hadn't known to look. The knowledge did not make her want to leave. That surprised her. She'd half expected that financial clarity would function as an exit, that once she knew she could stand alone, the decision would make itself. It didn't. What it did instead was change the quality of her staying. She was no longer there because she had no alternative. She was there because she was choosing to be day by day, with full information and open eyes. That distinction was everything. By March, something in the household had genuinely shifted. It wasn't dramatic. There was no single moment of resolution, no grand reckoning that wiped the ledger clean. It was smaller than that, the accumulation of ordinary evenings in which Frederick arrived at dinner and asked about her day, and actually listened to the answer. The way he'd started deferring to her on social decisions that he'd once managed over her head. The particular morning he'd come to find her in the sitting room, specifically to tell her about a business matter, not for her approval, but for her opinion, with the openness of a man who had remembered belatedly that the person he'd married was also the person he trusted most. She was cautious with her trust. She did not offer it wholesale, because wholesale trust had been the old pattern, and the old pattern had allowed too much to happen without her notice. She offered it in measured, honest portions, watching where it landed, noting whether it was honored. Mostly it was. Not perfectly. Frederick was still at his core, a man who preferred ease over examination, and there were evenings when the old habits surfaced, the slight dismissal, the comfortable assumption, the look that said he'd stopped listening while she was still speaking. When it happened, she named it. Quietly, directly, without drama. "You've stopped hearing me." And he would catch himself and reset and try again. It was not the marriage she'd imagined at the beginning. It was something stranger and harder, and she suspected more real. It was in March that she saw Alexander Whitmore again at a gathering she'd agreed to attend months in advance, Lord and Lady Forsyth's spring dinner, too well established to withdraw from without comment. She'd known he'd likely be there. She'd thought about it more than she intended to, and then set it aside, and then thought about it again. She arrived with Frederick, which was deliberate. Not as a statement or a defense, she had moved past the need to perform her marriage to an audience. She arrived with him because they were attending together, and that was simply the truth of where things stood. She saw Alexander across the room almost immediately. He saw her at nearly the same moment with the particular awareness that had always characterized the way he noticed her entrance, the slight shift in attention, the settled recognition. He bowed. She inclined her head. Frederick beside her was still. Not tense, she had learned to distinguish his stillness by type, and this was the stillness of a man who is being deliberate. He excused himself after a few minutes to speak with Lord Forsyth, and the separation was natural, and she did not watch him go with anxiety, because she no longer needed to monitor everything. She circulated. Spoke with Lady Castleton, who has ever managed to communicate an entire editorial about the evening's arrangements with a single well-timed glance. Spoke with Mrs. Alderton about her garden. Spoke with young Mrs. Pennington, who was visibly quietly happier than she'd been 6 months ago, which told Anne something about the quality of small changes. Alexander found her near the window. Not the studied half-privacy of Lady Castleton's Thursday arrangement, but simply the natural geography of a room in which two people have moved in compatible directions. Lady Pembroke. His voice carried the same steady quality she'd carried in her memory for months. "You look..." The familiar pause. The choice of honesty over the automatic. "Well, you look genuinely well." "I am," she said, and meant it in a way she hadn't meant it when she'd said it reflexively months ago. "How are you?" "Good." He looked at her directly. "I've been glad to hear things settled. Through Lady Castleton, naturally." "Naturally." A small smile. "She is a remarkably efficient intelligence network for a woman who claims to be merely social." She would consider that a compliment. A slight dryness. "The Harrington matter. Resolved. Hartley managed it well." She met his eyes. "Your documentation was essential. I want you to know that. What you gave me allowed Hartley to build his case quickly enough to matter." "I'm glad." Simple. No performance around it. "And Frederick?" She considered the question honestly. "Trying," she said. "Actually trying, which is not nothing. Not everything, but not nothing. He nodded. She could see him reading the texture of her answer, understanding what it contained and what it was careful about. You're... He stopped. Started differently. You seem different. From the woman in the rose walk. I am. She looked at him steadily. I know who I am now outside of being his wife. That changes things. For the better. Yes. No hesitation. Considerably. A pause. The particular quality of quiet between two people who have things to say and are choosing the right ones carefully. Anne. He used her name the way he always had, as though it belonged to her specifically, not to the role she occupied. I want to tell you something. She waited. What happened this autumn? What you did. The accounts, Hartley, the Harrington exit. You did that. You found it. You built the case. You delivered it. His voice was level, but there was something underneath it. Something that was not detached. I gave you a handful of documents. You did everything that mattered. You stepped forward, she said, when I needed someone to. Anyone should have, but anyone didn't. She held his gaze. You did. And then you kept doing it quietly in all the ways that don't make a story, but make a difference. She paused. I don't know how to properly account for that. I've been trying to find the words for months. He was quiet. Something moved in his gray eyes, something honest and restrained and very present. You don't need to account for it, he said finally. I didn't do it for accounting. She knew that. That was precisely what made it matter. They stood for a moment in the particular suspension of two people who understand each other clearly and are also being honest about the limits of what clarity permits. She was still married. He was still whatever he was. A man who had been in her corner for reasons that had nothing to do with what he might receive in return, and who had never once placed a debt against her. I hope, she said carefully, that we will continue to be friends, whatever else is true or not true. We will. No qualification. Always. She believed him. That was the thing about Alexander Whitmore. She believed him in the automatic, unexamined way. You believe things that have proven themselves consistently. He had not given her a single reason to do otherwise. Frederick materialized at her elbow with the timing of a man who had been tracking her location with uncharacteristic attention. He looked at Alexander with the guarded, effortful civility of a man who owes someone a debt he cannot fully quantify. Whitmore. A nod. Correct. Controlled. Pembroke. Alexander returned it with equal measure, and the two men existed in each other's vicinity for exactly as long as courtesy required. And then Frederick's hand came to Anne's arm lightly, not possessively, with the particular tentative quality of someone who is still learning whether he is welcome, and she did not move away. They're seating dinner, Frederick said quietly. She looked at her husband, at the man who had been and the man who was trying to become, at the work between them that was not finished and might not be for a very long time. Then let's go in, she said. She let Frederick lead her towards the dining room. At the threshold, she glanced back once, not with longing, not with regret, but with the clear-eyed acknowledgement of a woman who knows where she is and how she got there. Alexander was watching them go. When her eyes met his, he inclined his head. A small gesture, respectful, final in its completeness. The nod of a man who had offered something freely and was glad it had been useful and asked nothing further. She nodded back and went in to dinner. The months that followed moved the way recovery moves, not dramatically, but unmistakably. By April, Anne had taken formal charge of the household accounts with Hartley's institutional recognition, her signature now required alongside Frederick's for any significant financial commitment. Frederick had proposed it himself, which had told her more about the genuineness of his change than any number of dinners. He'd come to her with the proposal and set it on the desk between them and waited. And she'd looked at it for a long moment and then signed the document establishing the arrangement, because it was the right thing, and because it was overdue, and because she was honest with herself. It was what she'd always been doing anyway, only now with acknowledgement. By May, Lady Castleton had occasion to remark at one of her Thursday gatherings that Lady Pembroke seemed the pause had been pointed and affectionate fully herself. The room had agreed with the warm consensus of women who recognized something true when they saw it. By June, Frederick had begun occasionally deferring to her publicly. Not dramatically, not in the way of a converted man performing his conversion. In the natural, offhand way of a man who had reoriented toward a truth and was no longer working to suppress it. At a dinner, someone had asked his opinion on a matter he'd recently consulted Anne about, and he'd said with the ease of habit, "My wife has a better read on it than I do." Turned to her, listened when she spoke, agreed when her reasoning was sound and said so. It was such a small thing. It was also one of the larger things that had happened in 11 years of marriage. She carried that moment with her in the days following. Not as proof that everything was repaired, but as evidence that repair was possible, that the material was still there, damaged but workable, if both people were willing to do the work without demanding that the other do it first. She was not the woman who had stood in the rose walk in June of the previous year. That woman had been competent, careful, and slowly disappearing not from the room, but from herself. Wearing herself down to accommodate a life that had stopped accommodating her back. Managing the appearance of a marriage while the substance of it hollowed out, too practiced at composure to let herself feel the full weight of what was being lost. This woman, the one who sat across from Hartley and reviewed accounts with authority, who walked into gatherings without bracing, who told her husband true things and held the space until he heard them. This woman knew exactly who she was. Had built that knowledge piece by piece in the hardest months of her adult life. She had built it by stopping. Stopping the managing, the accommodating, the quiet, invisible labor of making everything comfortable for everyone else, while her own foundation cracked beneath her. She had stopped and stood still in her own life long enough to see what was actually there, and what she'd found had surprised her. Strength. Genuine and not performed. The kind that doesn't require an audience. Judgment. Hard-won and precise. The knowledge of her own worth. Not as someone's wife, not as a hostess or a household manager or a social asset, but as a person. A woman with a mind she'd been underusing with instincts. She'd been overriding with a full and extraordinary capacity for a life she'd been too diminished to fully inhabit. In late June, almost exactly a year after the garden party, Frederick found her in the sitting room with the household account books spread before her and a letter from Hartley about a new investment opportunity. She'd identified a textile venture that showed the kind of careful, consistent return she'd spent months studying. She'd drafted a preliminary recommendation. She set it in front of Frederick without preamble. He read it, not quickly, not with the polite speed of a man performing attention. Slowly, carefully. When he looked up, something in his face was different in the way it had been getting different, not all at once, but in increments that had been accumulating for months into something new. "This is good," he said. "This is Anne. This is very good. I know." She held his gaze evenly. Not arrogance, not performance. Simply the flat, honest confidence of someone who has assessed a thing correctly and is finished apologizing for being correct. He looked at her for a long moment. And in that moment, she could see him seeing her. Seeing the full person, not the managed impression, not the wife-shaped outline he'd grown too accustomed to look past. Seeing Anne, who had been standing in front of him for 11 years. "I should have been looking," he said quietly. The echo of a conversation they'd had, but not performed. Real this time in a way it hadn't been then. "All this time you were—" He stopped. "I missed so much." "Yes." She did not soften it. "You did. I don't intend to miss any more." She looked at him for a long moment. At the man who had failed her in the rose walk and was trying genuinely and imperfectly to become someone who wouldn't. At the marriage that had nearly hollowed itself out and was being rebuilt day by day into something harder and more honest and more worth having than the comfortable performance it had been. She picked up the Hartley letter, set it back in front of him. "Then have Hartley schedule a meeting for Thursday," she said. "You should be there." "I'll be there." No hesitation. She believed him. And the summer of 1818 continued in the way of all things that have survived their own destruction and come out the other side, not unscarred, not unchanged, but intact, where it mattered, and stronger in the broken places for the careful, honest work of putting them back together. Anne Montgomery Pembroke had stood in a rose walk with 200 people watching and felt the full weight of being abandoned in plain sight. She had built her recovery from that moment without permission, without rescue, without waiting for someone to come and make it easier. She had found the shape of herself in the hardest season of her life, and she had kept it, carried it forward, worn it without apology, offered it without diminishment to a husband, learning to deserve it, and a marriage learning to hold it. People no longer thought of her as Frederick Pembroke's wife, the way they thought of a chair as belonging to a room. They thought of Anne Montgomery Pembroke, who reviewed accounts with Hartley on Tuesday mornings, who spoke precisely in rooms where women were expected to smile and defer, who had survived something public and painful, and had emerged from it more completely herself than she had ever been before. She had not needed to destroy her marriage to discover herself. She had not needed to leave to find solid ground. She had needed to stop standing in the wrong place and start standing in her own. And when she had done that with clear eyes and both feet planted, and no apology for the space she occupied, everything else had arranged itself around the truth of it. That was the thing about a woman who finally knows her own worth. She doesn't need anyone to recognize it, but the room changes entirely when they do.